So after this very positive message on the togetherness that is needed for the 2030 agenda and what we can do to achieve and accomplish it, we're going to turn the focus to one of the most difficult conflicts that we are facing today, the one in Syria. And Syria was one of the middle-income countries that Helena pointed at, and which is today lagging behind. And we are also seeing from the strive of refugees, which is risking to destabilize the region and also create more fragile states due to the shock of the migration and refugee crisis. So during this discussion, we will try to sort out what is the Syrian crisis about, what can we do, and we have a very distinguished list of speakers, again, in order to help us create that understanding. And we will start with Katrin Kisswani, which will give a presentation of what is it that we're facing. And Katrin is chair of the Swedish section of Medical Without Boundaries, and you've been working with inside of several conflict countries among Nigeria, Syria, Philippines, Haiti, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and South Sudan. And somehow you seem to drag yourself to the conflicts, and we hope that you're not dragging the conflict to this room, but rather the innovation of trying to find solutions. So welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello everybody, I'm absolutely not dragging the conflicts. I'm going to share with you a bit of how we have been working in Syria in this conflict and the challenges that we are facing, that we are seeing. So as mentioned, I'm the chair of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders here in Sweden. And I have worked in Syria. I have worked in the neighboring country for the Syrian conflict, and I have been following Syria for some time. And so the conflict in Syria is, as mentioned before, the largest humanitarian disaster we are facing today in the world. And it has entered now in its 6 years. And the brutality of the war and the political instability has created great humanitarian challenges and needs, medical needs. And the basic needs cannot be met in many areas. And we're talking about food, clean water, shelter, protection against the weather, cold, heat. And the healthcare system has collapsed and led to a greatly vulnerable population who needs to travel far to reach healthcare for injuries and the follow-up of those. And the brutality of the war is caused by all parties in this conflict with terrible consequences for the civilian population. The protection of civilian wounded and the healthcare facilities are not being respected by the different warring parties. And unhindered humanitarian access is similarly not respected. And it has become more complicated. In 2015, an increased number of countries entered the war with their military. We have Russia invited by the Syrian government, and the US-led coalition, including UK and France. This is an extraordinary situation where 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are now actively engaged in the Syrian conflict. And I can only say that we have all failed to aid the Syrian population. The humanitarian and medical needs due to this violence remain horrible. If you remember the box that Helena showed us in the beginning, we can clearly see that I think it was the green one with the conflict related that is becoming very large. And on top of that, you have the red one that is as well increasing, where you have preventable diseases that would not be there with a functioning healthcare system and the infrastructure. And in Syria, with the insecurity, with the large humanitarian disaster it is, this should have been the largest operation that Doctors Without Borders have today, one of the largest. But the access to population in need has been a huge challenge for us all. The targeting of health facilities and an escalation of the airstrikes on civilians have contributed to systematic destruction of healthcare. As a result, many facilities operate today underground, and in makeshift hospitals. And it's extremely dangerous to reach health facilities for the people in need, the sick and the wounded, even if and the one who reach, even if needed, they refuse to stay in these health facilities for as long as they should, because of the insecurity and the danger. So what this has led to is that these health facilities need to constantly change their position when they are detected and targeted. And the other problem is that it takes one attack to discover, to identify where these health facilities is. To give you an example, a crowded area, market or similar, get attacked. The patient, the people will very quickly try to reach the existing health facility, which means that after that they are identified. Other things that the healthcare system tried to put in place, the medical networks who's trying to work, is to separate their healthcare activities, the facilities, not to have all the facilities, not to have all the services in one location. In case of one location is hit, you have still half of it left. But this is another problem where you don't have all what is needed in one place. So me, if I have fever, where do I go? Or if I am injured, where do I go? Which can lead to death and increased suffering. Another strategy that has been used is a double trap military strategy to maximize the number of casualties targeted. Where a first attack with a certain number of casualties, you have rescue workers arriving to the scene, or you have the injured reaching these health facilities, and 20 to 60 minutes later, the second attack will come, where you have the big gathering of people. We are talking about the most vulnerable here. And we have a very, very vulnerable group inside Syria. Is the people who is staying or trapped in these areas under siege. Nearly 500,000 people are estimated being trapped in these besieged areas, used as a military strategy. These areas are isolated, where people have no possibility to flee to receive humanitarian and medical aid. And it's not possible for the aid to come into these places. And one of the examples that maybe some of you read about or heard about was in the beginning of this year with Madaya, where medical personnel reported about the starvation of people and empty pharmacies. And it ended up that the syrup, the medicines that is existing, was given to the children just to give them a bit of sugar to survive. And this came after, and nearly 50 people died due to this starvation after approximately 3 months of complete isolation. So how can we work in this complicated situation? Of course, there are great challenges in this provision of aid due to the high level of insecurity and violence. And what we are doing today is that we are not able to work as we would like to as a strong medical organization. And we are focusing, we are working mainly in the peripheries of the conflict. And as well, we are trying our best. So we are focusing on the periphery on the conflict, and we are trying. We have been forced to find new innovative ways to reach the people in need. In opposition-controlled regions close to the border with Turkey, Doctors Without Borders is able to maintain functioning healthcare services in 6 different locations. And however, with the security constraints, we haven't been able to expand these activities to other regions than the borders. And you can see here marked where MSF have its own activities. So this has forced us to today start with support projects, which is something completely very new for Doctors Without Borders. And with the focus, of course, on besieged areas. And today we are running 150 different health facilities, which is, we are supporting 115 different health facilities through regular cross-border supply of drugs, medical materials, paying incentives to the staff, and as well providing medical training. And all this is done through medical networks inside Syria. Other innovative ways that we were first forced to find was as well working across the border, being targeted as a medical facility. We installed a hospital inside a cave a bit further inside Syria, and even that one was identified and hit, and then moved further to install a hospital in a chicken farm. Some few photos of how it looked like inside the cave, and further the chicken farm. And as well that we installed an inflatable tent inside these to be able to have a surgical unit. And as I mentioned, this indirect support is highly unusual for MSF, which normally provide direct humanitarian assistance to all the people in need. And this is all indicates how severe the situation is in Syria, with all the security constraints. And since the conflict started in 2011, MSF has tried to get permission from the authorities in Damascus to extend our assistance to all parts of Syria, but still it's not possible. We haven't gained the permission to do so. And that's why we are working in very limited areas. And of course, outside Syria, we have a large number of civilians that fled the country, as you know, and we are working around in the neighboring countries to try to meet the needs. And we can as well see that there is a change of what type of patients we are receiving, from having mainly men with bullet wounds to today a mix of women and children with highly wounds related and injuries coming from highly volatile bombs and attacks. And of course, we will need to continue to develop ways to reach the people in need, and we will continue to demand full respect for independent humanitarian assistance to reach where the needs are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for not only giving us the perspective from the media, but actually from the ground and what is and what can be done, Katrin. So please take a seat while I try to invite the rest of the speakers. Mr. Dan Smith, you're the director of SIPRI. You're a scholar, professor, and a long-term server with the inside of United Nations, and been researching regarding peace and conflicts for a long time. Gun-Britt Andersson is a senior advisor to the think tank, previously State Secretary of Migration, and has a distinguished career with the inside of Swedish government, but also serving at the OECD, and is today the Vice Chair of EBA, expert group for aid studies in Sweden. We also have with us Anneli Bergholm-Söder, which is the Director of Coordination Operations Department at the Swedish Civil Continuing Agency, MSB, which is trying to do the groundwork of what can be done, and who has an experience from West Africa and other crises. And then we have Efraim Gomez, who is maybe perhaps best presented by telling that you're sort of running the Swedish campaign for the United Nations Security Council, but you're head of the Department for the United Nations Policy at the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs. So welcome all of you, and what we're going to try to do is sort out the crisis in Syria, and what is it that we actually can do. And we just heard a presentation from Katrin on what is being done from the medical side. But I want to ask you, Dan, how should we understand the conflict in Syria?
Well, you can tell the story from many different angles, and that's why it's a question which is worth asking. I would begin with two pieces of background to set Syria into a world context. One is that from 1990 for 2 decades, the biggest untold good news story in the world was the expansion of the global zone of peace. There were 50 armed conflicts in 1990 when the Cold War ended. There was a spike to about 1994, then a decline every year, bottoming out in the 2007 period. And in 2010, there were 30 armed conflicts. For last year, for 2015, the count by the Uppsala Department of Peace and Conflict Research is 50. So we've gone back up to the end of the Cold War, to that level. So the last 5 years, which is the period also of the Syrian armed conflict, more or less, is a period of increasing armed conflict worldwide. And Syria, for all its specificities and peculiarities, needs to be understood partly in that context. Then the second thing is the Arab Spring, 2011, the moment of hope. Looking back 5 years now, it doesn't seem so much like a spring as the beginning of maybe a decade or a decade and a half of widespread insecurity. So there is a regional political process going on, of which Syria was a part. It started as a civil war, partly inspired by the democratic movements and mobilizations in other countries. I think then you start to move into the specificities of Syria. On the one hand, really an unexpectedly brutal response by the Assad regime, far beyond what Gaddafi was even threatening. Extraordinary use of violent means on a large scale, but also, which I think is particularly sort of horrifying, is on a small scale as well, targeting the specific families of people who were on the demonstrations and so on. I mean, it was ruthless. It was unexpected because Assad, if you remember, 5 years back, he was interpreted as sort of almost like the reluctant president. You know, he hadn't been the son who was going to take over. It was the older son who was going to take over from Hafez al-Assad. And then Bashar was an ophthalmologist working in London. He has a British life. He was settled down, nice, prosperous lifestyle. And back he had to go to Damascus. And there was a kind of expectation all through his first decade in power that, you know, yes, he would agree to an amelioration of the regime, of the worst parts of it, because of his background, and it turned out not to be true. Then the second element which comes into play on the back of that very, very brutal and hostile response to the pressure for change is the geopolitics. And that's what brings in Hezbollah, the largely Shiite political party in Lebanon, and Iran, because of Assad's and Syria's importance in the regional power game. And then, making all of that worse, you know, the next layer that comes in over the top is the Sunni revolution. This is what brings Islamic State into play. Islamic State in Iraq, to begin with, the Iraq branch of Al-Qaeda, expanding into Syria, becoming ISIS, falling out with Al-Qaeda, so there's now two Al-Qaeda franchises fighting it out in both Syria and in Iraq. And this is a story which goes back beyond the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. It really goes back to developments in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt in the 1960s and into the 70s, Saudi in the 1970s into the 1980s. So this again is a very kind of deeply embedded part of regional history, which of course also takes in partly the story in Afghanistan. So you have all of these different threads coming in together. This is what makes the war both so vicious and so intractable.
Gun-Britt Andersson, Katrin with one of her pictures was showing how you see an outflow of people out of Syria. How do we understand the Syrian conflict also from the perspective of migration from refugees and the neighboring countries?
Yes, I will actually start. I am, as you can see in the program, a senior advisor of the think tank Global Utmaning. I have no direct experience now of the present crisis in Syria, but will make reflections going back to some years in time, to my years, 1992 to 94, when I served as director of UNRWA in Jerusalem. There, UNRWA provided basic services, education, health services, including growingly so, also reproductive services, and promotion of gainful employment to Palestinian refugees in the West Bank part of Palestine. Another of the 5 fields where UNRWA was and still is active is Syria. Let us hope that the Syrian tragedy will not be as protracted as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It remains a wound in the region, but maybe also an experience to draw some lessons from, lessons that are in line with the conclusions from the humanitarian summit recently in Istanbul. Seeing the Syrian crisis today, it's difficult to put one's mind to 2030, when nobody should have been left behind. What can be done now to include the Syrian population in the 2030 vision of a better world for all? The hope for an end of the conflict or conflicts must be maintained, as well as the right of return of all refugees and internally displaced persons. That day hopefully will come soon, but it could also take a long time before that will be possible. In the meantime, Syrians inside and outside the country should be helped to uphold their dignity. Assistance should be provided for immediate relief, but also with the clear objective of maintaining and developing human capital for the future. That all children get education and are well nourished are essential investments for reconstruction later of the home country, or for resettlement and successful integration in the host countries of refuge. Reading the document from the Stockholm Conference on Fragility and Peace Building from Istanbul, and not least the plans and Syria appeals from UNHCR and also UNRWA, I think that the principles of humanity, of resilience, and also development, they are in place. The neighboring countries of Syria should be commended, including Turkey, for managing the stress they are under as they host some 4 million Syrian refugees. They should also be commended for working with the UN agencies. We should do that even more. And the donor community, opening their own facilities for providing basic services, even including higher education for the refugees. The problem is that programs have been left underfunded, making the situation of the refugees very difficult, even desperate. Could one hope now that the lessons from last year of the desperate, deadly flight across the Mediterranean have been learned, and that enough efforts and funds now are dedicated for improvements for refugees and vulnerable populations in the host countries neighboring Syria, as well as in the European Union? Sadly enough, we now again hear the news that that people die on the Mediterranean. And I hope that this is an alarm clock that will actually now make us behave better than last year, from providing enough funding and assistance, and see to that at least all the facilities in Europe are well managed and well stocked in whatever is needed. Returning to UNRWA, while the Palestinian population is still displaced and the hope for a just peace remain faint, Palestinians themselves had the possibility to develop. Under strict WHO primary health care guidelines that I admired when I was there, basic health services have been provided in clinics run by the Palestinians themselves. And I think that is also very important, that the communities of refugees are themselves involved in providing the services wherever it is possible. And in fact, that has developed an ability to run a state also for the Palestinians, as they were running the UNRWA, both in education was also a priority. And wherever possible, efforts were also made to promote income generation so that people could have some hope of building a better life for themselves. In the so-called UNRWA fields, and especially in Jordan, but also in Syria, the Palestinian refugees have been well integrated economically. And I think today you will find Palestinian men and women well qualified around the world. That's an achievement, although their political suffering is still there. But as to political rights, the UNRWA joke at the time was that Palestinian refugees shared equal rights with citizens in Syria, meaning none. And the sad joke carries another lesson too. Everybody knew that Syria was harboring severe internal differences and contradictions. The Lebanon war and Assad, the father of the present president, his bulldozing on part of Hama to show that the Muslim Brotherhood had no place in Syria was, for instance, in very fresh memory. Thomas Friedman disclosed the Hama rules in the book From Beirut to Jerusalem. It seems these rules apply today, of what we have been hearing, a sort of very brutal way against your opponents. At the same time, Syria was advanced in many ways. And could more have been done by partners in our part of the world and the UN to prevent the unsustainable political situation from exploding? Perhaps early during the Arab Spring or even earlier. For the Palestinians in Syria, numbering about 500,000, the ongoing war means new suffering. Several of the camps are in war-affected areas, and more than half of the refugees are internally displaced. Some of them have made it to Lebanon and Jordan, where they as stateless have no rights. However, UNRWA make efforts to reach them with basic support wherever they are. A bit more than 1 million Syrians have reached Europe as refugees, and more than 10% of them have been seeking asylum in Sweden. We should receive them well, respect their dignity and their ability. They should be supported in all efforts to maintain and develop their human capital. It will benefit them and durable peace if and when they can return to their home country. It will benefit themselves and our society if they choose or are forced to stay in Europe. I sincerely hope that the decisions last autumn to grant, as a rule, only temporary protection for Syrians fleeing the war will not hamper their motivation and ability to start investing their lives for the future, here and now, here or there, here and now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for making a very important reflection and comparison to the situation for Palestinians, both positive sides of it and where to watch out. Anneli, your agency is working with refugees both inside of refugee camps and actually also with refugees coming to Sweden.
Yes.
How does the situation look from your perspective?
Let me just briefly introduce MSB. I don't know if everybody is aware of what we actually do in our operational task. MSB in the operational task, the mandate is to strengthen responsible actors to handle crises and disasters nationally and internationally, and to support coordinated decision making. That's the mandate. And if you look back at the situation and the refugee situation, both in the Middle East and in Europe and in Sweden, you remember well this autumn. Europe, I don't think I underestimate to say that Europe were not sufficiently prepared for this. Sweden did have solid systems to welcome refugees, but we were overwhelmed. I think we took 160,000 people fled into Sweden last year, and in October only 40,000 came. I just want to give you a brief overview of what MSB did in the Middle East, in Europe and in Sweden. Actually, we did most of our task in Sweden. And I didn't expect us, when the situation started, that we should. We have been supporting for quite a long time now in the Middle East a wide range of actors. For example, UN agencies and local actors in the area of coordination, information management, logistics and camp constructions. We have also via the civil protection mechanism in EU, supported Greece with house construction, already prefabricated houses for medical clinics in Athens and schooling systems. We have also assisted the UN agencies in the Balkan route, mostly with the camp acknowledgement and coordination and information management. But our biggest challenge was to tackle this situation in Sweden. As a national authority in this crisis management area, MSB was tasked by the government to coordinate the national management. And in that area, we started out with in-depth analysis on societal consequences to support the government and the national agencies. We supported the coordination of response of all various actors at local, regional, and national level. We included providing a common operational situation picture, as well as to identify areas where there might be need for additional action. I think that we identified that the weakest areas in the situation this autumn was housing, health, education, and security. But one of the absolutely biggest challenges was the unaccompanied minors and how to coordinate volunteers and civil society. It was a huge effort from the whole society to contribute, and to contribute well, you need to be coordinated. And we also supported the Swedish Migration Agency with their crisis management structure and methods, as well as technical support to affected municipalities and regional authorities. And that wasn't even in our imagination that we should do. We thought that Sweden had a very solid system, but the number really overwhelmed us. Just looking forward, MSB, of course, if there is a humanitarian access in Syria, we will be ready to move and to contribute with all our competencies. We think that we should be part of what's the dialogue in EU. And in Sweden, we all do this evaluation right now to see what we can do better in the future. But we see that we need to be more, we need to increase our knowledge in crisis management. We need to not only to reach an understanding that the coordination is necessary, but we need actually to accept coordination. That is a challenge for agencies, for UN agencies, for all of us, because a common understanding of the situation is necessary. Shared analysis of the consequences is essential, and a joint plan to meet the needs of the affected population as well as responsible institutions is the success. Otherwise, we just manage. We can't manage the situation, we just react to it. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for also showing how the world is actually intertwined. And as the State Secretary said, there are no national and no international issues. They are the same, and I think this refugee crisis is, in a sad way, exemplifying that. Efraim, what is a Swedish perspective, and what is Sweden trying to do through the United Nations when it comes to Syria?
Thanks, Johan, and thank you for organizing this debate, and thank you for inviting us as well. I should say that since the UN Policy Department at the Swedish MFA commands two set of broad instruments, the security policy engagement that we have in the UN, but also the development engagement that we have in the UN. So it's our way of responding to the request by the Deputy Secretary General to align our resources and start thinking more in the whole of government and not work in silos. And I think this goes particularly well for the case that we have here, apart from sort of thinking whole of government also when it comes to external and internal. And I mean, and I think it was useful also that Dan reminded us that the debate should have been timely before 2011, when we had a political opportunity to prevent this situation, which is something that we need to keep in mind as we move forward and we think about the political solutions that we wish to see for Syria, because this is ultimately what it's all about. We know this, the solution is only political. But I think I would like to share with you some perspectives, or maybe I shouldn't call them lessons learned, but I think that different strands of work where we believe, at least as Swedish government, that we need to work on Syria, and could by extension also perhaps be applied to other crises. Let's hope that we will not see another one of the magnitude of Syria again. But anyway, and the first one is, of course, and I think that Katrin was also she pointed to this in a useful regard. Think regional. We need to think the resilience that we need when we have a crisis of this magnitude is, of course, something that we need to construe not only in the affected country itself and its population, but also in the neighboring countries. And this is why the Swedish government has adopted a particular Syria crisis regional strategy with 1.7 billion Swedish kroners and $200 million US. Let's see if that would be enough. But we have encouraged others to respond in a similar fashion, and we did so at the London conference early February, which was important. But I think that more and more actors are starting to understand this and adopt. I mean, the understanding is maybe there, but they're actually trying to change their ways and having a more regional outlook. Second one is the protection of civilians, this strand of work. I mean, this is something that is deeply concerning for every one of us. And I mean, the disrespect for international humanitarian laws. Katrin, you mentioned the humanitarian principles of impartiality, humanity, independence, and neutrality. They are blatantly disrespected in the Syria crisis. And this is a joint work that we have together, that we need to work together with the actors and the governments, etc. We're going to have a Security Council debate on the 10th of June on the protection of civilians. Vice Prime Minister Isabella Lövin and Development for International Development Cooperation and Climate, she will participate in that. But that is mostly directed towards the peacekeeping operations and how they should protect civilians. But the issue in Syria is how can we make the actors involved in the conflict itself, the warring parties, actually respect this this bedrock of our humanitarian acquis. And the third strand of work is, of course, the protection of health workers themselves. And here we have, I mean, we could term it a groundbreaking resolution. I wouldn't dare to say that. We also have a Security Council commitment to this, recent one from early May, Resolution 22.2285. But it mostly extols, I mean, principles and commitments that we already have. And of course, here our frustration comes from the lack of political will to actually protect health workers. We know how to do it, but of course, at least if it can be a recommitment to increase the political pressures on the actors to actually respect health workers, then something could have been achieved. The ICRC has a Healthcare in Danger initiative, etc., which we are also highly supportive of. But this remains an area of particular concern to us. Then, of course, it's a question of joining up our assets and instruments. How can the WHO and together with the humanitarian actors, etc., work better in the field and the delivery in the field? Because ultimately, this is what it's about. And here we believe that we need to respect our different mandates, but there's much more we can do while respecting the different mandates still out in the field. And I think that most actors know this. And actually, if you talk to actors, you usually find that they can find their ways out in the field, but they can be on a headquarters level and on more, you can find some some stumbling blocks that we need to rid ourselves of. And then, and maybe I can auto-reprimand myself for this, we have to be for taking it at the very end, we need to be very strong on gender equality, on the gender equality perspective in all of our dealings with this. That goes for sexual and gender-based violence, of course, and also the respect for sexual and reproductive health and rights. Sweden, together with other partners, have a particular task in this regard, but it's actually something that all humanitarian and other actors that are engaged in the Syrian crisis need to be very vigilant of. Because we know, I mean, 60% of the preventable maternal deaths in conflict are in emergencies, and so that's an outrageous number, particularly if you compare it to the absolute numbers we have in emergencies. And so this remains a very, very important area for us to work with. And so a couple of the strands that I would like to highlight in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the panel for, I think, giving a very well done description of what is the problems that we actually are facing. Before we go back to that, I'm trying to be a bit more concrete on what is it that we can do. I would like to focus a bit on what was said regarding what is the possibilities for finding political solutions. And I would like to turn again to you, Dan. Where should we start when we're trying to create an agenda for peace, and what can be done with outside of what is already being done by the Special Convoy of the United Nations? What is the role that we, in some broad sense, can take?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the international level, at the high level, a lot of effort is going in. It is very difficult because the positions which many of the actors who perhaps from a democratic point of view you would like to support, the positions of many of those actors make negotiations hard. And one understands the sort of the emotional and psychological reaction that, you know, we will not talk with the barrel bombers. If we're going to sit down and discuss the future of Syria, how can we do it with the barrel bombers and the nerve gassers? Right? On the other hand, a conflict has never ended by negotiation except when the conflict parties take part in the negotiation. And the West, I think, started by being way too selective and saying, you know, well, we can't have Iran at the table. China and Russia certainly don't have a role. Yes, okay, we could have negotiations on peace in Syria without Assad. Well, these could be interesting discussions, but they're not going to be negotiations unless conflict parties are there. I think the first thing to recognize is that history over the past 70 years is full of agreements which have been reached and negotiations which were undertaken between parties who said they would never talk to those stinking rats on the other side. You know, I mean, Britain was never ever going to negotiate with the IRA. They're a bunch of terrorists. Oh, whoops, we got a peace agreement in Northern Ireland. How could you imagine that apartheid would come to an end in a peaceful way if you didn't know the history which said it came to an end in a peaceful way? The US was never going to talk to China, I mean, not to those dirty commies anyway, until they did. And so constantly there is this, it's happening. So I think that one thing that can be done is to simply to maintain that pressure, that if it is right that the only way that this ends is with a political settlement, then that will have to be negotiated, then it will be necessary to sit down, and at that time people whose job it is to do this are going to have to shake hands with people they would rather not shake hands with. But it happens, it's done, it's very often how peace is made. Peace is made much more often by pragmatists and realists than it is by the wild-eyed idealists amongst us. You would be surprised. The second thing, I think, is to shift to a completely different level. In the first several months of the political mobilization in Syria and at the beginning of the civil war, these bodies, the local coordination committees, sprung up in many different localities in Syria. And actually, when the first military pressure from Assad was coming on in a very heavy way, and the first calls were being made for the Syrian opposition to arm itself and for there to be external intervention in their support, actually the local coordination committees said, you know, we want to keep on doing this on the non-violent path. Now, many of them still survive, and in many, I mean, several hundred of them, and in many localities, you have a sort of relationship between a local militia, a traditional leadership, and these local coordination committees. So I think that much more needs to be done to work with them. And I think that one of the things which would be nice from time to time would be to be really asking Syrians, not just those who claim to speak for Syrians, whether they do so from the government or even from the opposition outside in exile, but to speak with Syrians, with their experience of what it is they want, of what it is they would like to push for. You will get a mixture of noises and of sounds coming back. You won't get an easy political program. But if people are to have any kind of power to be deciding their own future, then they have to have a voice. And for them to have a voice, there must be people who are listening. And I think that that is something which it's possible to do, whether you're in government or research institutes or NGOs or think tanks, whether it's a Médecins Sans Frontières type of NGO or a more human rights and peace education type of NGO. I think that connecting to the local level is an important part of the picture. Alone it won't be enough, but if it is left to one side, then peace in Syria would never be durable.
Efraim, is Sweden shaking enough hands?
Well, I would say so. But of course, I mean, our engagement to solve the Syria crisis, we try to bring to the table the assets that we have. And one of those was the point that I ended with. It's that if we engage women, we're more likely to have a legitimate, a qualitative, and effective peace in Syria. And so we've been working very hard on that one. But I mean, essentially, and we also try as much as we can, I mean, through the EU and in other contexts I mean, we would like to see the solution, even we can understand the logic of, you know, the US and Russia trying to talk to each other. It's important that the international community is engaged in a more institutional way at some point, and that means returning to the Security Council, but it has to be helpful for the solution.
We stressed, I mean, the role of women and young girls earlier, and you stressed it in your closing remarks, I mean, in the introduction, and also these days. And Sweden has a feminist foreign policy, which also puts some sort of demand of bringing women and children, women and girls to the table, then stress the local community. But does that also makes it more difficult for you guys to shake hands and then work in the other way around? How do you reflect and how do you work on this perspective of being very pragmatic, being in the negotiations, at the same time as pushing the principle when we know that a lot of these groups, these people, these men that we're dealing with is very much refusing to bring in women to the table?
Well, I can continue, Johan, because I think that we've actually, together with a couple of other partners, we've done a very good job in actually getting acceptance, not least from regional players in the Syria conflict, of accepting an enhanced role for women in the peace talks. And look how it translated, for instance, in the requirement that the parts of the opposition made successfully for a request that 30% of public office should be held by women in Syria in the peace. So that is important, that they're able to express their demands and also gain acceptance, I mean, from the other opposition. So I think, but it's a tedious work and demanding, but I think it's important.
Gun-Britt.
I think Syrian women were rather advanced, and I think there's a lot to build on there. But I will bring in the regional perspective, as you talked about, because I think it's very important now. It has been all along that see to that this situation will not destabilize the neighboring countries. It's a threat to them. They are carrying enormous burdens, and it's good to see that their needs are now part of the appeals to the UN, to UNRWA and to UNHCR and so on. And I think we need to see that. I mean, also I think they have a lot. From my time there, I know, I mean, it was a very, very close relationship between the civil societies in Jordan and in Palestine and in Syria, and they had been all around, and the families were spread all over the area, and so to have a good influence there and good impact there, I think could also help these more civil society peace building. And isn't that what Staffan de Mistura is trying also to talk to people in the cities and in the towns? Yeah, it hasn't worked so far, but I think there is a lot of civil society to work with there.
I think it doesn't work in the sense of bringing a quick result at that high level and changing the situation. And I think that, you know, the overall political strategic situation, the kind of thing that you read about in the headlines of the newspapers and see in the television articles, it's sad, but it's sad to say, but it's necessary to observe the reality. The military factor is going to stay enormously important in this for quite some time to come. So what has to happen, and what I think the special representative is doing, is trying to work away also at the foundational level. Peace will not come about without progress at the two levels, right? So lack of progress for the moment in the military, strategic, high-level political one, you keep working away there with everything that, you know, Staffan de Mistura's missions and so on, but you have to keep going at the more popular level. And I think that the thing about that, the message which I want to stress, is that it is at that more popular, the local community level, where there are things which, done carefully, many different actors can do. Whereas at the high level, you're really talking about a quite limited range of actors being able to achieve change.
Yeah. Anneli?
No, I just wanted to point out the importance to look at the idea of feministic foreign politics. And I think that if we start out to see what the society we are supposed to work in look like, you can go back to the Swedish society. How do people come to work easiest in wintertime? What roads do you start to plow? It's the ways or roads that goes to the daycare center. If you start out with that in the local societies at the regional level, then you can have a start in the discussions, I think.
Katrin, you showed a couple of pictures, which I think is, you know, really showing the importance of the issue and is giving some sort of groundbreaking perspective. And at the same time, Dan said that partly there is not enough pressure. But how do you as actors who are on the ground, who is seeing the reality, how can you help us to create that pressure, or raise the awareness, or
Yes. So first of all, I think so how to help to put pressure. Being on ground, why we are there, it's because there is needs. That's basically why we are there. And what we are doing is to try to reach the people in need. And as in the case of Syria, we have now a development of the crisis where you have the opposition, you have the government, you have different mix of groups, radicalization, and so on. And what we are doing on our level is, as long as there is needs, we are trying to reach the people in need, and that means that we have to meet with the different leaders on ground, with the different decision makers that is existing on ground, and to try to, with the mandate that we have, is to explain and to try to have the access to the people. And that's the leverage, the pressure that we are using on the ground, and which is very, very important. As you said, it's absolutely not enough. It needs to be on all levels. But yeah, that's how we work. Yeah.
What is it that would be, I mean, we're talking about health here, and how do we deliver health in these refugee camps and in these fragile states and so on? What is it that would be needed, from other actors, and what is it that you mainly need, and also for Anneli, in order to be able to provide that, and giving the people that is living in these situations both some sort of hope, but also trying to create these community relations, which was mentioned in the last panel, and which I think has also been stressed partly by Dan, which is somehow bringing the society together of what is possible within these circumstances.
I can start out. I think it's important to involve the community in what we are doing. I can give you examples from Liberia and Sierra Leone, where you can identify the structures. At that time, it was the Red Cross. To build the contingency planning, to build the responsibility by themselves, that is the most important thing, I think. And to give them the techniques, methods, and pride that they can actually do a lot of things themselves. And I think one of our things that is important too is to make it possible with the logistics. To make it possible for the medical health to come in, to make it possible for people to come out.
I think we have a couple of questions from Twitter, right? Anna?
Okay, we have a question which is from IFMSA Sweden. Compared to UNRWA camps, what is the future of the refugee camps in Greece, Turkey, and West Europe?
We'll have Gun-Britt answering that one. What is the next question? And then we try to divide them out for you guys. So
I didn't hear it completely, but I guess what sort of the difference between the UNHCR camps and what we see now in Europe? Yeah, the UNRWA camps, they are very, very organized now. And there, the UN organization in various ways have played the role of giving the norms what to do. But they have been run completely by the Palestinians themselves. And that has been quite a development exercise and a learning exercise. And of course, that can't happen immediately, and we don't hope that we will have these long-term refugee situations as we have had for the Palestinians. But still, I think Europeans should really listen to UNHCR and UNRWA and use that experience. And there should be norms for education. I think there are a lot of resolutions where every child should have the right to education, and there should be the basic health care and MHR and all these things. We don't know everything ourselves, but the UN organizations have a lot of experience, and they should not be shy to convey them to Europe. We need them.
And you're basically saying that you should have self-government within inside of the refugee camps and focus on health and focus on education.
Yeah, and whatever you can do, it depends on, I think, the context. Everybody has been talking to do things in the context, and that's very, very important. But basically, you should always mind human capital, human health, human development in the short run, in the long time.
Yes, next question.
No more questions from Twitter, but do we have any questions from the audience?
We have one question up there and one question there. So we take 2 questions, and then we're going to do a final round, and then we're going to let you all for lunch.
Hi, my name is Siavash Habibi. My question is regarding self-determination. I remember 3-4 years ago, this was a big part of the debate. And given that there were attempts at the Security Council to make coordinated attempts at helping in Syria and conflicts in general, and as I understand it, vetoes got in the way. And then opening for states to do their own action, which turned out to have complications since different states wanted different outcomes in this region, and rendering Syria a battleground between different powers that be. What does this say about the system that we have for coordinated attacks, or attempts, and what does it say about how we do, what we can learn from the situation and self-determination? Thank you.
Efraim, would you like to pick up on that one? Sure, I can make it. As I said, and I think, it's evident that we will not prevail with a sustainable peace in Syria if we don't solve it together. And we've had, there are certainly lessons that we've made in the past from different attempts to go to the council, and the former Secretary General Kofi Annan made probably the one that was that seemed like a very, today it seems like a extremely tempting offer. And so I think Dan also pointed to this. There's no way around having a collective solution that has the sort of support of of the big powers and including the regional players, but also, most importantly, the Syrian population.
Dan, you also wanted to step in.
I mean, your question finished by saying, well, what does it say about the system? I don't think it says very much about the system. I think it says an awful lot about the political leaders, but not so much about the system. I can easily envisage that framework that exists and those capacities which are there within the UN system and within governments that would like to support a peaceful outcome, aligning with the Arab League and even with the Gulf Cooperation Council. I can easily see that producing an outcome which is very, very different from the one that we have at the moment. So I think it is political decisions which were made, and sometimes the way that political issues are packaged. It's one thing to go into a negotiation saying, you know, here are our demands and our needs and our requirements. This is what we want to see come out the other end. That's what negotiation is about. It's another thing to go in saying, you know, certain results will be vetoed and certain participants cannot take part. With that, you are not really setting up for a negotiation, you're setting up for a political theatre. And if there are political leaders around who don't quite understand the difference between those two things, then that is the problem rather than the system.
Looks like we're facing a lot of problems. If that analysis, please.
Hello, I'm Sven Hessle, Professor of Social Work at Stockholm University. This morning we have been dealing with crossing borders, going outside, but I noticed that Anneli has been coordinating the Syrians coming to Sweden. My question to you is, how did we receive such another culture in our own country? And how should we continue meeting a different culture like they represent? Thank you.
That is a hard question, I think, really hard. I think we are all struggling with that. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think that we need to agree how to welcome people into our country, to have ideas of what kind of, are they supposed to have the same functional structure as we have? The same kind of benefits, the same kind of housing. And I think so, I hope so. I hope we can be a generous country in the future too. But I think it's extremely hard. But I think that the humanitarian capital and to find a way forward there, I think that's very, very important. But in the end, this is political decisions. We are an agency, and that is something else than the political ideas. We are supposed to give the analysis to the politicians to see what kind of difficulties we have in the society, to make them make better decisions. But otherwise, it's not for us to have views. I can have personal views, but not as an agency.
So can I ask you, are you using the word integration or establishing, or what do you call it? Is that another word?
Etablering in Swedish. We're actually, I think that what people or politicians mostly are talking about is integration. But after you are...
Assimilation, you mean?
That's not my discussion, but
we need to have that.
I think we should let her answer the question, and then we're going to try to move on with the panel discussion. Thank you very much for your question.
Yeah, and I think it's, when we have the decisions that people can stay here, I think it's how to make it easier for them to be here. That's my personal view, and I think that's important to look at that.
When you're looking at this panel, I think we have come to some conclusions, which is partly that it's actually not so much we can do when it comes to the political side, but it's political leadership that is needed, and there's a need of shaking some hands, let's put it like this. That the Swedish feminist foreign policy have actually managed to be important, and perhaps this is also a way of trying to make it a bit more concrete, because that is something that I think that we can all help for, and hopefully that can bring some content, further content into the Security Council candidacy. I think we have also again stressed the need of a local approach, the importance of creating a local community and the role of civil society within inside of that. And it's important to have focus on health and education. What is it that we can do for these people that is living within very difficult times? So, and that is partly what I think that we concluded when it comes to the former panel, which is starting to see that we're trying to find some trends that is, even though very diverse subjects, which is general, and hopefully that is something that we can carry with us. But as we're coming to a close, I would actually ask you to answer two questions, very brief. The first in, what do you think is most important that we do in the short-term perspective in order to give people on the ground a better situation, a better daytime situation? What is it that we actually can do, kind of concrete? And the second question is, when we're looking back at this humanitarian crisis, which has been going on for 5 years and as it looks will continue to last, how will we and how will United Nations actually be evaluated? And we can do like this. We can let Katrin start, since you started off, and we go the same circle as we started off.
Okay.
And it's difficult questions, and try to be brief, and
yes,
that will make it a bit easier, I promise.
Okay, very brief. Few points. For the first question, I think real political will, it's very much needed in the short term. Respect and to allow implementation, independent humanitarian and medical assistance to have access to the people most in need. And that we have to put pressure as well on the surrounding countries to help them to open up the borders and to implement safe and legal passage to Europe, which is not the case today.
And I think that's a very important message. And that will most probably also decide on how we're going to be evaluated, whether we do that or not. So, Dan.
Well, since healthcare and healthcare delivery is an obvious one, the thing that I would say for the short term and to the medium term is education, education, education. I think that the prospect of age cohort after age cohort of Syrians simply losing their educational prospects. Remember that half of those who are displaced remain inside the country. And the majority of those who are displaced and outside the country are in quite difficult conditions in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So this effort must not be only to do with integration of refugees into the European countries of their destination, hopefully from which they would want to take up the opportunity to return in a later, better time. It's also got to be focused on people in the neighboring countries. And it's a very large effort which is required. It has a lot of opportunity for doing things. In terms of how the evaluation will be, I doubt if it will be very positive. I think that one thing that I would emphasize, and perhaps you would expect me to as director of a research institute, which says that we have to base our policies on evidence. We stand or fall by the evidence, and we specialize as an institute in providing the most reliable evidence about some of the most abstruse questions that you can find. The first thing would be to say they acted out of ignorance. Actually, they showed profound disrespect for the politics, the culture, the history of the region when they, the international political leaders, thought about intervening there and what to do. They believed there could be quick solutions in the face of very long-term problems. And they refused to ask a couple of simple questions about external intervention. I mean, simply, if you're thinking about bombing in Syria or using force, have you ever done anything like that in the vicinity before? No. Second question, how did that go? Third question, would you like to think about that before doing it again? And perhaps the fourth question is, do you remember Einstein's definition of madness?
Gun-Britt.
I think you have had very good answers to the question, but I think to really mind, in the present situation, mind the children and mind their future. So education, 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 but also the basic health services should be there all the time. And then what we have been talking about, context, I think is very important, and that goes to understanding the history of the Middle East and what that means today for the conflict and the possibilities of solving the conflicts. What I think also what will remain is that, I mean, Europe must get its acts together. Europe should not leave this crisis in as bad shape as it is now. We have to share responsibility, and we have to mind the people that have to flee from Syria.
That's very wise. Anneli?
We see countries that are destroyed. We see people that are refugees living in camps. I believe of empowerment. I believe that we should share our competencies.
Efraim?
Well, when government acts, it acts politically. And I mean, on the core issue, I think it's important to recall that the UN is composed of its member states. And so, and the solution that we're looking for, and it has to be sanctioned by the Security Council at some or other point, we will have to deal with the member states that have a particular say in this, and we will relentlessly, I mean, call for a political solution to the crisis on the political side, on the core issue. On the humanitarian consequences, I think that we've really touched upon the issues here. And here, I mean, for the Swedish government, remains essential that we politically, financially, technically, morally support our different humanitarian actors, including ourselves, of course. And then, I mean, we also need to prepare for the day after. And this is something that we're taking very seriously, the Swedish government, trying to prepare ourselves as much as we can. And also because, I mean, peace will not be an off and on issue, particularly maybe in the areas where we see where Daesh, we're liberated from Daesh, where we already see areas today, and how we can, in an intelligent, sustainable fashion, deliver some basic services so that there's no relapse, and to strengthen their resilience in an early phase. That probably will remain essential for Europe peace.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the panel. I think you've been both giving a very concrete and political description of the situation, and also giving very concrete recommendations of what can actually be done right now during these difficult times in one of the worst crises that we are facing and that we will be judged about. And I think it's interesting that we're always coming back to local community, health, education, and young girls and young women, and not at least data collection, which is why we started off with Elena, of giving a very good brief on what is the actual situation, and that is what we as citizens can use to keep our politicians accountable. So thank you very much. I have allowed the time to slip a bit, but you will have lunch for 1 hour, and we will be back here at 1:30 for the next discussion, which is going to look at some country-specific issues and trying to be a bit more positive tone, looking at what is it that we actually have done, what have actually succeeded, and what is it that we can learn from that. So give the big ups for the panel, and enjoy lunch.